This whole situation with the Twitter files and Matt Taibbi, speaking of, journalism and free speech, I feel like this whole situation has gotten out of hand. I did talk to Matt. That was before this particular push is happening now, where Delegate Stacey Plaskett wants to send him to prison for 5 years for supposed perjury or whatever in the interview that he had with Mehdi Hassan. Do you think that this kind of is a signal to other independent journalists in reference to taking on these types of projects? Do you feel like this will put fear? Because my fear is that other journalists are going to be afraid to cover things or uncover things that are more hard hitting, so to speak, because they're afraid, what if I get called to Congress like Matt Taibbi and they threaten to send me to prison?
Yeah, sure. That's what it's about. The tragedy is Elon Musk is so mercurial. He's kind of a loose cannon. Matt Taibbi is a friend and a journalist I've long admired. And he was doing serious and important work, I feel, on the Twitter files. I think it also shows you how desperate how frightened the Democrats are. They know that their margin of error on these elections is really small. And so I don't think they're going to send him to prison. I would be surprised. But yeah, it's a way of intimidation. And also it's a way of discrediting real journalists. Look what they did to Cy Hirsch, probably our greatest investigative journalist. Again, it was all about attempting to discredit Cy over the revelation that we blew up the Nord Stream pipeline, which was, as Cy said, kind of hidden in plain sight. Because people like Victoria Nuland called for it to be done and then celebrated it afterwards. And then you had reports in the New York Times that the Russians were seeking bids to repair it. Well, they were going to seek bids to repair a pipeline they'd blown up. So, it's the press. I've done it a long time. I started covering the wars in El Salvador in the early 80s. It's really atrophied. It's quite frightening. When I look back, and the press was always very flawed, of course, but when I look back on what was possible when I began and what's possible now, you see how the walls are really closing in. And what they're doing to Matt is kind of an example of that.
All right, Chris, my last question for you. What advice would you give to someone who is considering becoming an independent journalist, given the level of suppression that we have today compared to when you first started?
Well, that's what frightens me. So people like myself, Glenn Greenwald, Matt Taibbi, who already have become kind of publicly known, can switch to Substack, which I've done. And that has been, quite lucrative and allowed me to continue to do my work, Matt and Glenn as well. But if you haven't established that kind of profile, then it's extremely difficult to get found, noticed, and funded. And what frightens me is that the new generation of journalists who should be, essentially nurtured and carrying on the kind of work that many of us have done, it's impossible for them to make a living, to make a salary where they can. None of us ever got into journalism to make money, of course, but they can't get published and they can't get remunerated for their work, and that is just, again, extremely frightening, because you have whole area with the atrophy of kind of news organizations. You have whole sections of government, especially on the local level, city level, courts, police. They're just going dark, and these people, without any kind of scrutiny, and the scrutiny was always flawed. It was never what it should be, but without any kind of scrutiny, then these centers of power will just do whatever they want, and you can't take on corporate power because they'll sue the hell out of you. Cy Hirsch's last great investigative piece for the New York Times was on this multinational in Gulf and Western, which was all mobbed up. They were all linked to the mob. And in the end, the Times was so frightened, they wouldn't run it. They neutered it, and he quit. And he said, at that point, I could still take on governmental power, although I don't think we can anymore. But I realized we can't take on corporate power. And that's what I've been watching over the decades that I've been a journalist. They have just, the bars are coming down. And then, of course, wholesale surveillance makes it impossible for whistleblowers. Obama was awful on this, using the Espionage Act to go after whistleblowers. and then you're essentially left. Either people hack material, Chelsea Manning or Edward Snowden, and get it out to the public. Julian Assange, who did not hack, by the way, he's a publisher. And the Trump administration used the Espionage Act against Julian. The first time it was always used against whistleblowers. Now it was for the first time used against a journalist, is being used against a journalist. So we're essentially ending the capacity for a free press. And I would argue we virtually already ended the capacity of journalists to shine a light into the inner workings of power. And that's very, very frightening, because that is a major step towards authoritarianism.